All right, everyone. Welcome to January 19th, 2022 meeting of SIG Auth. Let's kick it off. We have a few items on our agenda. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, awesome. So today we have one announcement, which is 124 enhancements freeze is 18 Pacific time, Thursday, February 3rd, and then PRR is soft freeze on Thursday, January 27th. So if you have a cap that you're working on, please make sure you're making progress on that and ping the folks you need to get approval and review. I don't see anything else. So we're gonna go straight ahead to discussion topics. So first off, there is a cap for Kms Observability. Sorry, Jordan, did you want to add something for announcement?
No, it was something about the enhancements freeze, making sure people got not only caps merged, but also things in the tracking spreadsheet. So
cool. Thank you for adding to that. Speaking of caps, so first one on our agenda is the Kms Observability Cap. Anish opened that cap. Do you want to walk folks through that? And if you have any questions, please share that here. Anish, are you on? Okay, go for it.
Few of us have been meeting every week on things that we can enhance for the KMS plugin. So some of the areas that we have tried to look at is observability, recoverability, and then performance. So we have categorized that, and then we have like a living doc where we are working on it. So the first thing that we wanted to focus on was observability, and we wanted to keep the changes short without any breaking changes. So the first thing that we're trying to do is actually add UID for requests that go from the Kube API server to the KMS plugin. Because today, if we have to do any kind of correlation, the only way that we can correlate errors or requests coming in is by looking at logs in KMS plugin and then correlating the API server logs based on the timestamp. So what we're trying to propose as part of this cap enhancement is to add a UID field in the Proto API, so that for every encrypt decrypt request that we make to KMS plugin, we generate a unique ID and then add that as part of the API request. And then we are also planning to implement a wrapper in the API server so that any logs that is generated for these KMS envelope encryption calls have the UID, and then also maybe have additional metadata around the name, namespace, and then the group version resource. So that if I, as a cluster admin, want to look at logs, then I can look at the KMS logs and then correlate that with my API server logs. And then this UID can also be passed from the KMS plugin to the external KMS store, so that can be used for auditing purposes. So there were a couple of options that we considered. One was basically using the audit IDs that we can string along from user originating request all the way to the KMS. But I think we talked about it during the last SIG Auth call. Not all the requests that are made to KMS plugin originate from the user. Some of it is during the API server cache warmup. So there is no way to correlate the user request there. So for now, we've decided to just generate a UID in the API server for every request that it's making to KMS plugin, and then start the correlation between API server and KMS plugin. And then in the future, we are exploring an option where we can use the audit ID annotation and extend this so that we can use this UID with audit ID annotation. So we have a cap for it, and then Rita and Mo have been helping review it. And we would love to get more reviews on it and work on it in this release.
Any comments, concerns?
I think the main thing I have related to this is, so I think what's described in there is totally fine. It's a very small change, and I think it's a straightforward change. I struggle to map the Kubernetes like API guidelines and stuff with this gRPC thing that we have on the side. Right, like for example, this API is a beta API, but then like the encryption configuration is like GA v1 API, right? And like that's already kind of weird because you configure the thing that you configure is done apparently, and this thing over here that is being configured is not done. So that's weird, but also like in this particular case, and I commented on there, which is that this change that we're proposing to make, it's unclear to me how it flows through any graduation criteria or any feature gate. Like as described, to me, this thing just starts off as GA, as in we're adding a UID. Hope you're fine with that. Like, I don't really know what else we do in this case. I mean, I think back to the CSR duration cap, and because of just basically concerns around storage of the new field and the fact that you can have external implementations. We had a cap that went through at least beta and hopefully 124 GA, and had a feature gate. Do we want the same semantics here? I don't know. I don't honestly have a strong opinion on if we do or not. I just want to be consistent with what we think the project should do. So that's really my open question. I think the actual work is straightforward.
Yeah, there are a few reasons we have like feature gate progressions. One is if there's potential issues that might come up, the feature gate gives us a simple way to sort of cut off the problem. And so the surface area of this proposal is pretty small, but it is like adding data to audit stuff, and it is adding data to outgoing requests. I could imagine a backend that didn't like new fields showing up in the gRPC request. Like that would be weird given how gRPC and Proto works, but it could happen, right? So that's the sort of thing that a feature gate would let someone who didn't care about the audit ID functionality like turn off, and then come to us and say, hey, I see there's this new field coming in, like this is weird and it broke me for some reason, scale reasons or unexpected data reasons or whatever. Like I don't think the risk of those particular things is high, but that's the kind of thing that a gate lets someone turn off. I agree that the gRPC stuff doesn't always map well to the API conventions. Those were very clearly written around like REST APIs, and then secondarily the config file APIs, which sort of reuse the same machinery. So if you're trying to follow those to the letter and are having trouble, I'm not surprised. Feel free to point that out and like jump into the API review channel or open issues or pull requests to that doc to like add gRPC specific exemptions or notes. That's fine.
At a high level, do folks have a particular approach? Like, I mean, certainly the safe approach is to add some feature gate and use that gate to, I guess, enable if the UID is going to get passed through. I don't actually fully know exactly how the proto looks on the wire. I presume if the field is not set, the binary data that is actually on the wire does not change at all.
It depends how you do it. If it's a pointer field, then it can be omitted completely and nothing changes on the wire. If it's a non-pointer, then it will, or it can get serialized as a 0 value, but unknown quantities should be ignored by the thing on the back end. Yeah, this probably don't need to go into that level of detail here. Like I said, the two things that this is proposing don't seem like high risk things. So I don't feel strongly either way, but just remember that our ability to react quickly if we release something and there's a problem for someone, it's like a 1 month response time. And maybe is breaking if we try to roll back something that we previously released default enabled. So at least having an option the first time we release something, if we're not 100% sure, that'll be good for everybody, is helpful.
Okay.
I saw you tagged Clayton as the reviewer on that, since he was one of just a couple original code reviewers on the storage transformation stuff. I would suggest reaching out to him in Slack or something to make sure he's aware of it. It might have gotten lost.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the call out there. Yeah, he's the last person standing on the encryption at rest approvers list.
Yeah, separately, it would probably be worth talking with him about, like, it's good that the KMS discussions are happening and people are interested in improving that. It would probably be worth talking with him about getting some more redundancy there in approval or oversight of that package.
Yeah, I can do that. Other than the graduation things, do folks have any thoughts around this cap?
I haven't been following closely, but maybe this has already been answered, but how is the UID being generated? Is that I mean, what kind of random number generator are you using underneath it?
So we would just use the existing UUID package that we use. So within the cap, we reference, or Anish references, I shouldn't use we. Anish wrote this cap. I was just present. We use the UUID package, or we will use the UUID package, for example, that is used to generate UIDs on admission reviews. They serve a vaguely similar, but not exactly same purpose as what we're trying to do here. And that, if I remember correctly, uses the goes crypto random number generator under the hood, which if anyone cares, that that does get swapped out if you have like the FIPS compiling stuff. So if that's the concern, or if there's other concerns about the random.
Yeah, I was just curious because this UUID is acting as a nonce, so I just wanted to know how guaranteed it was not to repeat and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the function right there that is on screen right now. So certainly, if there's any concerns with it, we could use something else if there was a need.
Yeah. Okay. I know the Linux kernel just upgraded its guarantee, I think about a month ago. So, but anyway, yeah. Okay.
Any other comment for this cap?
I was going to make, so this level of detail isn't in the cap because it's really just about implementation. I had proposed this to Anish as a way we could implement this. Basically, the thing I wanted to guarantee was that over time, it was very unlikely that we would forget to log the UID in any scenario that is important to us. So my suggestion had been just basically that we would just make a wrapper implementation of the transformer interface, whose entire purpose is to just log the UID and otherwise to do basically nothing else. And then, we could have tests and stuff around that. But my thought there was that over time, as we add new transformers or otherwise tweak things, or because I know a while back I'd seen someone have a cap for like a gzip transformer or something, which seemed like a perfectly valid thing to maybe want to do for your etcd data. Just kind of making sure that it sort of exists. Anyone have any concerns with that sort of like low level implementation or other alternatives?
I'm not sure most people on the call are familiar enough with the storage transformation stuff.
I know it's like as not as far as you can get into the weeds of API machinery.
I don't know. Maybe sounds maybe fine.
I'd be interested in knowing what kind of code wrapper you needed around the wrapper that was already there. But like, you know, in concept, do I object to zipping? Not really. If I had zipping, would I try to use it as a way to finally store CRD v1? Yeah, I probably would. But beyond griefing Jordan, I don't have plans.
Yeah, I just you know, at a high level, right? Like this is just about making sure that when things go bad, that there's enough information in the logs. And I just wanted to make sure, like, logs are hard to assert over time as being useful. And I wanted to try to have it built in a way that's unlikely to drift. That's all.
Okay, anything else? All right, if nothing else, we'll move on to inline CSI and ephemeral volume cap. Who opened this? Go ahead.
It was me. Hello, I'm Jan from SIG Storage. And this has been discussed a couple of times in the previous meetings. We would like to move inline CSI ephemeral volumes to GA in this release. And from the previous discussions last year, I understood it that the ephemeral volumes should be used, the CSI inline volumes should be just used for ephemeral volumes, which are safe to use and should not be used for persistent volumes. So we are updating the cap correspondingly, because previously it was using pod security policy. And now it has a security consideration chapter somewhere that basically copies the stuff that is in pod security standards about inline CSI volumes, that they should be used for ephemeral volumes and risky inline CSI drivers should use third-party admissions and so on. So we definitely plan to document that. We will update our documentation for CSI driver vendors to use ephemeral volumes for safe data and not expose insecure parameters. We can do that, but I am 100% sure that there will be a CSI driver that will break that, because people really want to have inline volumes in pods using CSI drivers to access persistent storage. They do it now with NFS volumes. They will want to use it with CSI drivers too. So whatever we document is as SIG storage, whatever we recommend, I am pretty sure people will break it. Is this something that's okay for you?
So I spent some time talking about talking about this with Michelle, also from SIG Storage. And I had actually gotten confused about there being two ways to use sort of ephemeral volumes from within a pod. So we had talked about ephemeral volumes, and there actually is an ephemeral field inside a pod, which drives the same workflow as creating a PVC and then getting a PV bound to it.
Yes.
And so I think that is what you were just referring to, using ephemeral volumes for persistent storage. And basically the only difference between that, and the inline volume is one drives the PVC PV flow, and the other just invokes the CSI driver directly.
Yes, sort of. The one we call generic ephemeral volumes that creates PVCs, it gets you empty there basically. It doesn't need to
gets
be
you
empty.
what?
It gets you empty there. Yeah, like you get something empty, or it could be populated via snapshot or whatever. But
Right.
the use case is like empty there on steroids.
Right. It's an ephemeral volume, which could be pulled from a snapshot. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So for persistent storage, we're saying you should use PVCs. For ephemeral volumes that are built on top of like persistent drivers, you could use this ephemeral. So it'll provision a PVC and then tear it down. And then for inline stuff, that is focused more at the like secret providing volume or credential injecting volume, things like that.
Yeah, like that is the primary use case, definitely. Problem with that is that people use in-tree NFS volumes inline in pods today. They will not have that possibility with the generic ephemeral volumes with PVCs because they need to specify the NFS share they need to use. They want to use the NFS mount basically. And that's not possible with generic ephemeral volumes in PVs because they create PVCs and like you can't tell what you want. You get something provisioned for you based on the storage class.
It seems like this is wanting two separate things. It's wanting to give someone inside a namespace access to something which they should have to create a PV to access. Like they're wanting control over cluster level storage configuration from within a pod, and that doesn't seem to match anything else we do.
Sort of like the use case is that there is an organization that traditionally uses NFS. Everybody has a home directory with proper ownership, proper access bytes, and a person in that organization runs some workloads in Kubernetes. They run some workloads on their home, on their machines, on their desktops, and all that they want all that workloads to access their home directory that has the proper access bytes. And they run, of course, the pods with the right user ID and GID. So it's kind of mixed scenario where you have like traditional workloads and run some jobs on Kubernetes. And those jobs need access to your data. And like you can't create PVCs because that's
I mean,
dangerous.
what you're describing seems like it depends on other aspects to also be configured, like the UID group ID stuff to be configured properly and enforced properly. And so
Definitely.
I guess I would expect the thing that is making sure your pod is limited to your UID and group ID to also be enforcing like the NFS storage stuff. I guess it seems like wanting to like build in a policy around one aspect of it when really other aspects are required as well would lead people to create inline drivers that are only partially protected.
Okay, but these people, they will write a CSI driver and they will have this admission plugin that does the policy that enforces UID, GID, and that also controls which volumes you can mount. Like they can write it. They will write it. And that's fine with your pod security standards. It says like if the risky inline drivers should already use a third-party admission controller, which they will do. They will need it anyway for the GIDs and UIDs.
To me, it makes sense to say we should not have an opinion about this. If you're going to write a thing that is not inherently safe, then you need to put protections around it which understand the contexts that would make it safe. So in the case of the NFS one, it's a UID GID type of restriction.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So we will update our documentation that faces CSI driver vendors that the CSI drivers that implement the ephemeral volumes.
Can we say inline? Ephemeral is, maybe it's just me. Ephemeral is very confusing because it it also maps to the generic ephemeral, which drives the PVCBV.
Yeah.
Maybe inline is the one that is
so
dangerous.
We will document that if a driver implements the inline volumes, then it should be safe. And if they want to do something unsafe, then they should provide a third-party permission plugin that will enforce, then it allows users to do some policy. Would that be fine?
I have maybe a dumb question, or don't quite understand what's going on. Is there something that prevents CSI driver NFS from using like the service account of the pod to do the NFS connection?
No, it's up to the CSI driver, and we can't enforce it in Kubernetes. Like CSI is a very open protocol, and the driver can do anything. If they choose to implement a service account checking, they can, but we can't enforce that.
Yeah, the parameters that are passed to the driver are arbitrary. Like if you're using this inline volume in a pod spec, you can specify any parameter you want. And so what parameters the CSI driver consumes determine how safe or unsafe it is. So you could imagine the CSI driver consuming parameters that it like passes blindly into like kernel mount calls or something. That could be like super disruptive or destructive. Or in the case of the NFS one, one of the parameters it consumes is like information about which NFS volume it wants to mount. And so like depending on other things like UID, GID permissions or SE Linux control, or like how the NFS stuff is configured on the nodes, depending on other stuff, that might let a pod author access arbitrary NFS data. So it's pretty specific to the driver, whether it's safe or not. And then if it's unsafe, what other conditions need to exist to make it safe, whether it's other attributes of the pod or attributes on the namespace or configuration that's opaque, that's on the nodes that the driver's like, oh, no, it's cool. Like we configure our NFS shares this way. So if you try to access something you don't have access to, you might get them out, but you'll be forbidden from viewing the files. Like it's opaque to the driver.
I guess I had never thought about Kubernetes trying to control that. It seems like if I want to write some arbitrary unsafe software that runs with node credentials, I'll be able to do it no matter what mechanisms and deploy it on my nodes, and I'm the cluster administrator. Like, it's not clear how much Kubernetes can do to keep me from shooting myself.
Well, I think the proposal in the last couple meetings or last couple months was to have sort of a binary yes or no, this namespace may access this driver type of policy that could be built into Kubernetes. And I've been kind of opposed to that. Like, I think there's reasonable alternatives using PVs and PVCs or using the generic ephemeral volumes. And if people don't want to do that, they still want to do inline stuff. I suspect, even for the NFS example, like, would it actually be acceptable to just deny use of the NFS driver to all these namespaces? I would guess not. I would guess you would still want to allow it conditional on the UID and group ID aspects. And so that goes beyond what a built-in admission thing would do. As soon as you start like tying in some second piece of information.
Yeah, the question of whether a cluster admin always knows in advance what the software he installs does is, in my experience, they are not always super aware of all the minutia. And having a way to say that, you know, this use of a CSI driver inline is known to be unsafe, and basing whether it's allowed on a per namespace basis based on the privileges of that namespace combined with the knowledge of the CSI driver, and gives you a way to handle it in the field in a way that is slightly more refined than be perfect. But once we have a list, can we build it? Yeah, we can. It's entirely buildable externally to be able to handle it, you know, in the field on the clusters you have. And I think that is likely to be the direction we go.
Okay. I will say, just having sort of come into this area sideways via these discussions, I got super confused by the difference between the ephemeral field, which drives the PVC flow, and the CSI field, which does inline volume specs. I know there's been, like, updating the documentation a few times has been mentioned, but it would be super useful to have like if you want to provide this kind of storage, do this with your driver. If you want to provide this kind of storage, do this with your driver, type of flowchart with the caveats and warnings. Like, if you want to allow pod authors to do it, provide this kind of driver, but watch out for like arbitrary parameters or kernel parameters, or like something that doesn't just bury the documentation on the particular page talking about inline volumes, but actually lays out, like, here's, as a CSI driver author, you can provide volumes via PVCs and they can be consumed these ways, or you can do it inline and it can be consumed this way, and here are the considerations. Like, kind of the overview with the pros and cons of each might be helpful. And maybe that already exists, but
Right.
I had a hard time finding that.
We have something, maybe it's not perfect. It's definitely, it doesn't mention the security, definitely. So we need to update that. Where is the chat here?
Okay.
We have something. Maybe it's not perfect.
All right, thanks.
I can see
I'll
it's
copy
pretty
that.
updated. Okay.
Oops. All right.
So maybe as a conclusion, like the recommendation in the pod security standards about inline volumes, it still holds. Kubernetes will not provide any policy, and we will just update documentation in this and provide guidance about the security. Is that correct?
That matches my expectation. And I think we already had issues filed for the drivers that we knew of that were making use of inline functionality with problematic exposure.
Yeah, Samba driver, I think they dropped the support, if I remember correctly, but I'm pretty sure that the NFS CSI driver, they will either want it there or they will fork it. because it's used.
Okay.
Yeah, we can document it in the driver that about the security consequences, definitely. But I don't think we can just remove it easily.
Yeah, I don't think we were contemplating removing it necessarily. Especially in the case of the NFS stuff, it sounds like there are mitigations with the user ID and group ID controls. And so figuring out a way to effectively apply those could be reasonable.
Okay.
So like what's the action item here?
I think as part of SIG storage, wanting to GA the inline field, like making sure the docs are clear and call out these implications. And I think we've already engaged with the drivers that are known. There were a couple drivers that were known that were using this. So I think it's primarily a documentation issue.
Okay. All right, any other comments for this cap? Okay. Pod security plans for V1 for V124, GA or not GA?
Yeah, so Tim put this on here. I'm not sure if you on, Tim.
Yep. Hi.
Cool. I've talked a lot. You want to talk some?
Yeah, sure. So pod security admission is currently in beta as of 123. At one point, we had discussed that going to GA by 124 would be ideal from a pod security policy deprecation standpoint. So as the timeline below says, PSP is slated for removal in 125. That means that customers or users will need to migrate their clusters off of PSP in 124 or by 124. So in other words, before they upgrade to 125. So it would be really nice if pod security was GA, so they could migrate from pod security policy to a GA feature. A couple other considerations there. Yeah, so as David mentions, PSP is beta, so it's not the end of the world if we're telling them you have to migrate from one beta thing to another. If pod security instead went to GA in 125, then probably a lot of users are not going to actually do this migration until 125 is out, just kind of realistically based on people's upgrade timelines. And so if it went to GA in 125, they at least have some assurance that the thing that they're migrating to is not going to change or go away in the future. Yeah, so that's consideration. And then the other consideration is just, PSP went to beta in 123. 123 hasn't been out for that long. I don't think that we have a whole lot of feedback, either positive or negative. I think we just don't have a lot of users of pod security yet. So yeah, I think that's the current situation. Is anything you want to add, Jordan?
I linked to the tracking project, just calling out some of the outstanding items. There aren't a lot. There was one sort of cleanup usability one where if you submit pods to a restricted namespace, you'll sometimes get a forbidden error from the baseline policy and the restricted policy that basically say similar things, which is ugly. So it'd be nice to clean that up. David brought up an issue where it would be our EDE tests should configure the namespaces they create so that a cluster that is enforcing restricted policy by default will still pass EDE tests. That got started at the very end of last release and didn't quite make it. So I think that is a good requirement for GA. I would want to see all of our EDE tests explicitly set the pod security level they need to pass, and ideally scope themselves to baseline or restricted where possible. The only other thing that was in progress was related to the pod operating system field, which is working its way through feature lifecycle. Kubelets, so the field got added as alpha in 123. Kubelets enforce the field matching if it's present in 123. And so at the point where the field goes GA, we can update pod security to only pay attention to OS specific fields, which is nice. It'll make the restricted policy cleaner. If you're creating Windows pods and you think it's silly to have to specify like restricted capabilities and Linux specific things in your pod spec just to pass the restricted policy, you can say, this is a Windows pod, and pod security could relax and be like, oh, cool, then I'll only require you to opt into restricted Windows related things. So it'll be nice. I don't think it's a blocker for GA. That's more tied to the lifecycle of the pod OS field.
The lack of feedback on the beta level for something that is going to impact every pod and every namespace, it really seems like you'd want to get feedback about how it's working. And I haven't seen any of that yet.
Yeah, all the feedback I've seen have been from people who were writing blog posts about the feature, which was not nothing, but it also wasn't like wide user signal. 123, like realistically, I think is just now like rolling out to sort of managed production environments. So requiring the migration from PSP to pod security in 124 to be from one beta thing to another beta thing is not the end of the world.
Yeah, like I know we are still working through how we handle a migration plan, how we get clusters that did not previously enforce to enforce, what that looks like in terms of auditing and user opt-in, and how it plays with other admission plugins that we currently have. That's all still being worked through. And not that we're necessarily like, you must wait for us, but OpenShift is fairly knowledgeable about like how this stuff works. We have years of experience enforcing security on pods. And like, we haven't gotten our feedback back. I haven't seen other people's feedback come back yet either. And so planning for a GA without that feedback worries me.
Yeah.
Other than a desire to encourage people to migrate from a beta thing to a GA thing, is there a strong benefit to GAing in 124 versus 125?
Could I ask a maybe dumb question? So I know PSP is slated for removal in 125, right? Could we, instead of removing it, disable it by default or something, and just give you a, like, if the concern, like the concern I'm hearing from David is we don't have enough feedback and our runway is relatively short. So like we now need to make a decision. And I guess I'm asking, can we make our runway a little bit longer?
I would prefer not to change our policy on the removal of beta APIs. If we have a beta replacement, I would prefer to suggest people move to the beta replacement that we have every intention of taking GA.
Yeah, and that also sounds totally fine. I guess the thing I'm trying to ask is, can we decouple in some way the PSP runway with the PSA runway, I guess? And I think, you know, David is suggesting we do that, which is basically it's okay that you have to migrate from a beta thing to another beta thing. I worry that we GA something as important as pod security too soon and then realize we've done something bad. Too late. I mean, yes, we can fix anything, but you know, we've had recent conversations on like the SIG Auth threads about V1 stuff is forever, like really, it's really forever. And you know, you can kind of tweak it if you have to, but you don't get to take it out. And I think that's a great and good policy.
Yeah, for pod security beta, I don't know that there's a huge downside to planning to GA in 125. Basically give an extra cycle for 123 use and I guess maybe early 124 use. I will say that the current discussions in SIG Auth are around like, should we really be enabling beta things by default in production? And right now it's focused just on REST APIs, like new REST API endpoints. It would not surprise me if the same question was asked about other beta things in the future. Like, should we really be opting all users into beta things in production by default? And so in the, like, it's probably not relevant for this discussion, but I think it's worth asking the question, like, if we think it's good enough to turn on by default, I would expect a pretty crisp list of things that would keep us from going to GA. And if we, like, is it just user reports that we're waiting on? And if so, in the future, if we are not enabling beta things by default, how are we going to get that? I don't know that it's particularly relevant for this, since it is on by default in 123 and 124, but.
So I think that it is possible to get feedback without having something on by default. If we look at cluster that people who respond to a PRR survey, for instance, 30% of people turn on an alpha feature in production. So they 30% of cluster. Yeah, 30% of people turn on alpha features in production. So like they can find it if they want to. We have not been idle. So turning it on, we found the EDE issue because we were, you know, trying it early, pushing things through, seeing what broke. So I think if this had not been enabled by default, I believe that our feedback would still be coming about now. And that feedback, at least the hardest parts for us are around the migration of turning on and forcing by default. And it could be that it is worse for OpenShift than for anybody else, right? It could also be that it's hard to turn on, and maybe if we get feedback from, I don't know, 2-3 people who've tried to turn this on across a wide number of clusters, they'll be able to say, like, if it was just this little piece that was different, I'd be able to do this more easily. I don't know whether we will or won't, but
one thing to clarify there, like, one of the things we worked really hard on this feature was that it is easy to turn on, and then you can selectively enforce. Like, enforcing is a different step than is the feature on. So,
sure. Okay. The difficult part is enforcing, where you get the maximum benefit by enforcing in as many namespaces as you can.
So I guess it seems like there are two aspects there. One is someone just coming to the feature cold, like they aren't doing any enforcement in their clusters today and they want to start using this. Like we haven't gotten a lot of that feedback. We've done benchmarks and our test coverage is actually excellent, but we haven't gotten user feedback, especially with interacting with other policy mechanisms. So that's something it would be helpful to have more signal on. Your feedback, I think, like the migration aspect is specifically related to like transitioning from PSP to that. And whether we GA pod security in 124 or 125 or later, if PSP is gone in 125, the graduation timeframe of pod security is sort of irrelevant.
The current issue is actually facing having dual enforcement mechanisms. You have previous enforcement mechanism A, you have new enforcement mechanism B. It is not pod security, it's something different. And and how do you have both of these turned on at the same time and make sure that they have some sort of coherent, we can create pods and have some reasonable predictability about whether they're going to work or not.
Okay. Okay. Would it, I think if the main thing we're waiting on is signal from users, especially users trying to manage migrations, we should actively seek that out during this cycle so that if there are changes that would be helpful or need to be made, we could work on those while in beta and try to deliver things in 124. Otherwise, we'll be in the position where changes would have to happen in 125, and I don't think we'd be ready at that point then.
Yeah, it is Standa's top priority for the next 2 months.
Excellent.
Make it run.
Okay.
David, please stop abusing Standa. Standa's such a nice person.
Yeah, he is.
I do wonder if it's the migration aspect that is making it harder. Like
So-
people who are using old PSPs.
I can't speak to all cluster cases. I'm not trying to. The migration, the very first stage of if you start a new cluster, how you turn this on was fairly straightforward. Even the stage of if you have a cluster and it's already running workloads, how can I enforce what I currently have? Fairly straightforward. The difficulties come in with you have a different enforcement mechanism today and you want to support both enforcement mechanisms tomorrow. How do you reconcile the two? And pod security policy is one example. I believe there are other secondary enforcement mechanisms out there. So.
Okay.
Okay. And
So for
I
120
guess,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
For 124, like the ED tests and user feedback on migration and policy coexistence are the two things that I'm hearing the most concrete that we need to work on and resolve. Is there anything else? If I know we're out of time, if people have other specific things they would like to see, please note them here or reach out to Tim or I or jump on the list. We want to make sure we're using the time in 124 to resolve stuff well.
I guess how does the GA timeline for pod security impact the PSP removal? I think we kind of jumped around it, but
because PSP is beta, I think migrating from PSP beta to pod security beta is reasonable. I don't think that anyone should be waiting for pod security to reach GA before moving from PSP to it.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so this is independent of pod security GA, right?
My opinion is that it is.
I think that it is as well.
Well, I just want to record that. Okay. Anything else on this? We're definitely out of time. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the chat.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah, take care.